Okay, I interpreted the instructions, as it were, implicit in this, constructive suggestions, as a request for some kind of mixture of fatherly advice and practical tips. So that's what I'm going to do. And let me just start by pointing out, some of the things that language research has to offer. As Lyra pointed out, it's often some people think of language as outside culture, and actually, it is by far the most complex cultural construct that we have, and so it's an important target, obviously, for sort of diversity research. It also clearly offers us some kind of privileged access to how folks think. And I also want to point out that language research has been going on for centuries, and actually a lot of the material we have comes from missionaries. And together, those two groups, linguists and missionaries, are particularly sensitive to what is a key problem for diversity research, which is the translation problem. Now, I just want to point out there have been two recent developments, or relatively recent developments, where there's quite a lot of sort of stuff that we can draw on generally. So one is the language documentation movement, where there's a lot of evolved sort of best practice has kind of crystallized. And second recent development is the construction of very large databases for languages of the world and so on. And that actually offers all sorts of opportunities for people who are not particularly interested in language, which I'll sketch. Okay, so first, just on the language documentation movement, a lot of the things of sort of ethical suggestions and so on, I think, are very valuable that come from that movement. These are just some of our own websites, for sort of stimulus materials and practical tools, computational tools, and if you wanted to know, can you do certain kinds of phonetic analysis on MP3? A lot of modern video cameras only record in MP3. Then go and look at our, you can find sort of little A4 sheet that will tell you what you can and can't do. And that sort of thing. So there's a lot of information out there. Turning to the language and cultural databases, I mean, a lot of you will be clued into this, but maybe not all of you. So I think it's just worth going through this. So Glottolog is a wonderful, pretty exhaustive bibliography of everything that's ever been written on any particular language. It'll also give you all sorts of other measures, like some kind of measure of endangerment, which you're interested in. It's a rough proxy for like enculturation, and so there's a fantastic amount of information in Glottolog. And that has also isocodes for languages, which it's important, just actually being sure that that ethnography goes with this group and that languages which goes to the same group and so on. So there are all sorts of important hooks there. Glottolog is also tied into a big collection of databases, which is under construction, called Glotto Bank. And so under there's Gram Bank that I've been partly responsible for, which is a grammar database, and then there's a Phonobank and a Lexi Bank, so lexical lists from languages of the world and so on. So these are sort of big developments, and they're hooked into ethnographic databases like dplace, which uses, of course, the linguistic codes, the isocodes for languages, and also it's using the language stuff, you can produce these lovely phylogenetic trees, the use of which I'll sketch in a moment. So we are many. I think we're coming from many different disciplines here. We're not fully representative of all of the work that's going on in in the study of sort of different cognitions, as it were. For example, there are lots of NGOs that are working, like Conservation International does a lot of very interesting ethnobiology, for example. So I'm coming for a sort of a particular nook in the language sciences, but sort of with a background in those disciplines. And I should just point out that I think that current sociocultural anthropology is very much concerned with large globalizing sort of communities these days. They're right. I mean, that's a whole fascinating area of research. However, I'm particularly, myself, interested in very small groups that are sort of a bit left aside from these waves of globalization. Now, anthropologists, the sociocultural types, tend to look at this as kind of hopeless, at best romantic, and at worst sort of post-colonial, or colonial throwback. And but the reason I think for the interest in these small ethnic groups is if you want some contact with how the world used to be during most of human evolution, then these groups are of very special interest. And as I made the point that we're losing them fast in my other lecture. Now, on that sort of basis, so those are the sort of, I'm just coming from this particular nook. So, but on that basis, I'm going to deliver some sermons. And this is always dangerous because, either I'm preaching to the same religion, in which case what I will say is boring, or I'm preaching to the other religion, in which case what I'm saying is nonsense. But anyway, here it goes. So I'm going to do this in the form of sort of 9 basic principles. So number 1 is avoid Galton's problem. So if you're interested in human universals, or you're interested in testing between individual variables, and you want to know whether they're independent or hooked together, and so this was Tyler's problem, with matrilineally hooked to sort of linguistic complexity in some interesting way, sort of social complexity in some way, and Galton pointed out, hang on, you've got to check that any any 2 variables that seem to go together aren't just inherited from a common ancestor. So so this is the problem, and so you need to control for phylogeny and borrowing. And so there are 2 ways to do this. And that's what I think is perhaps not so obvious. The obvious way is you try to select independent samples. So cultures or languages that are not related in any way. And the other method, which is maybe less obvious in a way, is you control phylogeny by looking inside a phylogenetically related group. And so these are the 2. I'll just sort of point out the kinds of things that can be done with these. So if you are avoiding it by sampling across phylogeny, so what linguists typically do is if they're trying to do a cross-cultural sample that is representative of sort of diversity in the world, they're going to pick 1 language. In theory, they ought to pick 1 language from each language family. Problem. Some of the language families in the world are huge, and some of them are tiny. In the case of my Russell Island language, it's a monad. And so we've got this problem, and that so like 1/3 of the world's languages are absorbed just by those 3 language families. So then in practice, linguists cheat, and they'll take from each major branch of one of these big language families. The other problem is, how do you control for borrowing? Well, what linguists do typically is, select from sort of major continents, continental type areas. That may or may not work because firstly, the different areas, there are vast numbers of huge differences in the numbers of cultures and languages in the different areas. Secondly, things like sea lanes actually may be major arteries or channels for borrowing, and so actually this is pretty hard to do very well. Okay, so still, there are nice things you can do with this, and I'll just this kind of method. I'll just illustrate this very quickly. So we were interested in what you might call the design space for language. So this is Dan Dennett had this made this point. What's cultural evolution and natural evolution, natural selection? What do? They find great solutions to various design problems. So then you can ask, okay, and they do that within a design space of some kind. So now you want to know, well, what's the design space for a possible language? So one thing you can do is take, a vast number of parameters for grammatical, for example, grammatical differences, and then you can see. So we'll just do that. Take a couple of hundred dimensions, right? And then we can just ask, actually, if we measure languages on those dimensions, where do all the languages fall in that potential design space? And so Chomsky would have predicted, okay, originally he would have said, okay, there'd be one great clump, right? Later on he went to think, oh, wait a minute, you know, by throwing us through just a few switches, you can produce sort of a few different clumps, right? So that would be the kind of, you know, there's some predictions there. Now, so how are you going to do this? Well, of course, you're only going to use unrelated languages. So now it's hard to get data on, actually, there are only 450 language families. But we don't have data on a lot of these. So to get grammatical data on 100, you can do. So you can get 100 independent language families. We're actually building up these big databases now, which will give you much better data. But so then what happens when we map all of these languages into this sort of design space? What do we find? That's a good, sort of good kind of question you can ask. This is from 100 unrelated languages from one particular database. And you can see, oh, well, there's no obvious clusters. These are just reduced. Those hundreds of dimensions are reduced to two here for visual purposes. And then here's another database. So it's a different set, actually, of languages, and using different features too. And again, it's not obvious that there's any clustering here. No, I can't. I don't think this is merely a kind of. I don't think this is the right way to actually analyze this. I mean, you need much more fancy search for clustering. It's going to be really. I think we'll use machine algorithms and so on to try to get at sort of like k-means clustering and so on to try and get a better analysis. But were you to throw in sort of related languages, it would look a bit like this. This is fake because when you really throw them in, all the bits will move around. But it just gives you an idea. I mean, that related languages do cluster, and unrelated languages don't. And so that gives you just a sense of okay, that. It's all those kind. No, this is actually on what we call morphosyntax, so morphology and syntax of languages. So this is. I'm doing this as a kind of demo. You can do this on lots of other dimensions, but these are grammatical dimensions, if you like. So it's things like singular, plural. Do they make a distinction between dual singular, plural, or only singular, plural, or not at all? For nouns, let's say, that kind of a thing. Okay, so that's just the sort of illustration of, you know, it just seems to indicate that structural diversity looks relatively unconstrained, which is sort of an interesting finding. So that's something you can do using the first method. Oh yeah, but I just point out that actually these small samples are, you know, they're not actually geographically properly sampled, right? Because that's an extra constraint. You've now got to worry about potential borrowing. So if you did get clusters, you wouldn't know actually whether it was due to borrowing. Okay, so the second technique is then to sample within phylogenies, and this is what anybody interested, for example, biologists interested in gene linkage is going to do. So they want to know whether, you know, gene A, when you change gene A, do you somehow have to change gene B? Do they have to go together? So, and so you can, if you've got a phylogeny and you can map, you know, onto the leaves of the phylogeny, you can map the states of variables. Clearly these are not, you know, these are not, changing one doesn't seem to affect the other here, right? The red and the blue. Whereas here, it looks like once you have a change here, now we don't know whether this is, but certainly this chunk has now seemed to have gone. So there's some evidence there that you do have, as it were, gene linkage or value linkage across parameters. Okay, so just to give you an idea of this sort of practically, we did this on the so-called word order universals. These are suggestions by Joe Greenberg that, for example, if a verb comes before an object, then there'll be a preposition before a noun. So that's like English. On the other hand, if you flip the verb to the end of the sentence, so the object comes before the verb, then there's going to be a tendency for that preposition to sort of flip over the noun and become what we call a postposition. And so you can check this out now. So you can check this out. It turns out just if you just looked at it without controlling for phylogeny, this looks true. If you control for phylogeny, and you do, so you got your large language family, and now you're reconstructing using Bayesian phylogenetics. You use Bayesian phylogenetics to get the tree, usually from the lexicon. Then you can use Bayesian phylogenetics to try to reconstruct the states of ancestral nodes all the way up. And then you can try and figure out whether, when you change one of those features, like the verb position or the prepositional position, whether you get a knock-on effect, right? Because then the verb has to change, or vice versa. So I won't go into this in detail. I'll just say that this is for 4 large language families. That particular Joe Greenberg feature, the relationship of the noun to the verb, the postposition or the adposition to the noun. So that's adposition is either a postposition or a preposition. The relationship of the noun to that thing and the relationship of the verb to that thing. This is connected in Indo-European. It is also connected in Austronesian, but not in Uto-Aztecan or Bantu. So actually, it's not a very strong universal when you control for phylogeny. This is just a demo of the importance, I think, of controlling for phylogeny. Okay. So this is actually quite a good method if you're interested in this, in the dependencies between variables. Okay, but the problem is it's restricted to very large groups of, the only way you can do it is you've got a large phylogeny, large cultural phylogeny or a large linguistic phylogeny. So it is actually a method of limited application. Anyway, there you are. That was just one of my principles. Principle 2 is dear to my heart, which is just to point to the perils of translation. And even the bombing of Hiroshima has been attributed to a mistranslation in diplomatic dispatches. And so actually kind of, this is something that haunts practical affairs, obviously. But it also haunts anybody doing cross-cultural testing because of instructions in particular. So linguists just know that, equivalence never exists. There isn't such a thing as an equivalent translation. It just doesn't happen. Now, even between closely related languages, there's always slippage. And you just have to know that and sort of plan around it. Just to take a sort of trivial example, supposing you have a little instruction like put the DAX on the table or whatever, right? And now you were to translate this, for example, into Yelitnya, well, there'll be 3 verbs for putting, depending on the sort of orientation of the object when it lands up. So there's going to be different instructions. In Zeltal, there'll be 27 verbs to choose between, depending on the nature of the material and its orientation. As to the on, I'll just show you sort of the way in which even a preposition on has kind of overlapping meanings across languages. So here's a bunch of languages which actually have a strict on meaning on top of and in contact with. But many languages don't make a distinction between sort of super adjacent plus or minus contexts. It's Japanese. Many languages will conflate attachment. Many languages will even have underneath being the same as on top of, and so on and so forth. So there isn't, even on this sort of trivial level, every bit is going to vary. Okay. So those are the perils, and of course they come to haunt your instructions. and so the point is, you've got to research your. I mean, you can't. You've got to really take this seriously, um, and and of course also for informed consent and other critical moments, as it were. I also think, though, that the even more serious is that the sort of framing of the problem can be alien or not match with the local perception. I'd love to give lots of illustrations here, but for reasons of time, I'll just give one. So we had a project on comparing sort of emotional expressions and so on across languages, and so we used these Ekman faces, which you're probably all familiar with, and the underlying theory here goes back to Darwin, of course, with the idea that the face is essentially a kind of mirror of the emotional soul. So, you know, it's what you see is what you get, kind of, because it's an automatic kind of response system. And so actually, it's problematic on Russell Island just to even just to elicit the emotion words, because they don't have a word for emotion or feeling. You only have a notion of mentation. So anyway, that's already a problem. So you have to ask, how his mentation, how did it become something like that? And and what's the answer you get there is, oh, he's just great. He's happy. Oh, she's happy. She's happy. And what about these? Oh, they're happy too. Oh, wait a minute. What's wrong with these guys? And well, the reason it turned out, after a lot of sort of thinking about it, is that the interpretation is overwhelmingly interactional. It's not sort of emotional. You interpret faces in terms of interaction response when you're telling somebody something. This particular culture is very much into kind of dyadic face-to-face. They go within a few, like 2 feet of each other. And so they're very much into actually using the face in interaction. So here's just some sort of glosses. His mind is good. Look, he's talking to somebody. And so on and so forth. And so we actually did quite a lot of work on conventional facial expressions. So we used like 2 cameras facing each way. So we got large samples of this sort of material. And on the basis of this, I can say quite confidently, there's a huge range of conventional facial expressions used in just in interaction. Just to give you a sort of a clue. So if you look at the lady on the left, that is actually a conventional yes. And this guy on the right here is doing exactly the same thing. It's also, it's around in Melanesia. It is, yeah, which is also interesting. Yeah, from the point of view, how do those things get around? Borrowed. So the upshot of this was that So this. What about this one? So it turned out that nose wrinkling is also a way of saying, "Wow, how amazing," or polite, "No, thanks very much," yes, and so on. So, okay, so well, it turns out that that if you go into it, they do have a notion of spoiling your appearance, so complete sort of loss of face, as it were. But you really got to probe. They get their first interpretation of this. And actually, here's just a reminder, I think, but if you're interested in any phenomena, actually, of any interest, you've got to get at it from multiple angles. You can never go through one task. But I actually just feel that this is one of those cases where we'd be learning from this. And couldn't we, so this is Dan back then, because, for example, I mean, why can't we actually reverse the test? So why, so we could try to take one of these exotic interpretive frames and then try it out on the weirdo natives. And so we sort of ask, she's in a conversation, who's she talking to? What's she talking about? What do you think? And so I think that we really ought to be much more inventive about trying to do this stuff the other way round. Okay. I think I think this is in line with actually quite a lot of the remarks that have been made before. Okay, so my principle 3 is know the target population. And the first bit of advice is please don't be a tourist researcher. It's actually quite fashionable nowadays. You know, you're interested in, I don't know, can people tell, you know, do people like harmonic chords over disharmonic chords or whatever? So you fly in somewhere, drop off, you know, play the guy something. You find somebody who can translate for you, and then you go off to the next place. So this is quite popular nowadays, this kind of operation. But I mean, without knowing anything about the local musical system, I mean, this is hopeless. So you really have to, you know your ethnography, and there's really there's nearly always stuff you can, you know, really research. And if it isn't on your particular group, then it'll be on a neighboring related group. Now, this is easier said than done, but, you know, my advice is speak the language. And, and of course, if you can't, then you've got to work with somebody who can. And yeah, I'll have some remarks about that later. Or further advice is avoid an interlanguage, and because now you're doubling the chances of translation errors, so you don't want to do that. So it's better to have somebody who really speaks the actual target language. Another little bit of advice is beware local brokers. These are the people who are out front, often from a community, you know, making contact with other communities in the outside world. But these, of course, are the people who often represent an alternative power structure. They've got all sorts of interests of their own. They're interested in restricting your access and so on and so forth. So you really need an introduction from somebody who's done work in that community before. Maybe they're a native who's gone out into the wider world, or maybe they are you know, an anthropologist or a linguist, or as I say, one of these NGO people or whatever. You need an introduction. You need to get into the right people. Okay, so the other thing, of course, is you've got to attend to local sensitivities. And these can be sort of unobvious. I'll just give you an example of my own kind of putting my foot in it. So we ran some really quite nice, I think, a project on body parts description around the world. I mean, see, body is one of the few universal objects. So it's a nice thing to run around the world, ask, okay, you know, how do you name, you know, your knees and your elbows and so on? But my folks are not the slightest squeamish out on Russell Island to you know, about human genitalia or whatever. So there's no problem. Obviously, in some places there will be a problem, and you can do all sorts of nice investigations across languages. But so I thought, okay, I'll go the next step. Let's look. Let's start to do kind of the innards. You know, the internal organs. What do people know about these? What do they name? How do they name them? So on. So and so this is how they kill a pig. And so I was studying this, and they choke it there, and then they get all the insides out. And as they're coming out, I could ask them, you know, what are the names of these parts and so on. I'm kind of beginning to run into a brick wall. Okay, wait a minute, you know, maybe I don't know anything about the names of the innards. That turned out to be wrong. They do know, they've got a whole, you know, elaborate knowledge about internal organs. But they were cannibals until 100-odd years ago. And of course, you know, and nowadays, as it were, the modern cannibals are sorcerers. And sorcerers, what they do is they get inside your innards and, you know, like twist your liver. And so anybody who knows a great deal about innards would be suspect. So they're not going to volunteer this information too easily. So that's just a sort of way in which you can put your foot in it, right? Okay. Principle 4, beware interface issues. So I think Dan brought this up beautifully with his protocol problems. And And I think that my advice generally is you've always got a pilot, and you've got to just reckon on a design cycle. First time around, it ain't going to be any good. Then, especially if you're doing cross-cultural work, it'll work there, but not there, and you're going to have to retool and try again, and so you run a design cycle over a number of field seasons or whatever. I mean, time-consuming, of course, but I think it's essential. I might just point out that I think that I think Dan also mentioned this, right, about money. Anthropologists have long pointed out, money is the universal social asset, because where do you use it? You use it where you don't have a social relationship. You don't pay your relatives to come to your mum's funeral or whatever. I mean, it's unthinkable. So where do you use money? Just where, okay, there isn't anything else. There's no other social tie. So if you use money, what you're doing is sort of getting unsocial behavior in some way, which could be important for something like your ultimatum game. Anyway, for the materials and operations, if we have found a kind of useful rule of thumb, is if 4-year-old Western middle-class kids can do it, then probably it will be okay for illiterate people in far away, as it were. Now, I have to just emphasize this does not mean that those illiterates are mental age of 4 years old or something. It's just the interface problems are such that if you're unfamiliar with materials and paper and pencil in Dan's case and so on, then this is just a kind of a way in which you could get sort of test out before you can begin. All right, visuals. Actually, there's some really surprising problems come with sort of visual stimuli. Inability to see depth. Inability to actually recognize things, inability to see depth, inability to distinguish sort of mirror images. I'll just show you this because this is an example of how you could learn through design failures and actually do something interesting. So, this is now transferring you to a Mayan community, Delta-speaking community in Chiapas. And we were just piloting these kind of roughly mirror image stimuli. We'd made these in the field, that's why they're not actually, we weren't able to reverse the images properly. But to our surprise, and I could just play you this, folks thought that these were identical. Oh, well, let's show you. Here's
Bintik ehel. Ini segini. Pahal pisin. Hiç bilen.
Panas. Panas de elek de şimdi. Ta aktik na şimdi.
Pero bilel till mig väl. Ai.
Goes on and on.
Till mig har kommit bilel med det. Ai.
Ai.
The interesting thing is, couldn't get her to name the difference being the inversion of these two objects. And we thought, well, because these are what sort of north, south, east, west speaking folks, and so we thought, oh well, let's just say basket to the west there and to the east there, or to, no, absolutely not. So actually, on the basis of that design sort of failure, as it were, we went on to show that they have systematic mirror image blindness, these folks. That's to say, they just don't distinguish them visually. And the kind of thing that is sort of surprising. Anyway, there you are. So you could get a result. We got a kind of interesting result, although we don't fully understand it. That's another matter. Okay, principle 5, find appropriate participants. Here, I just wanted to mention that, so I've done quite a lot of eye movement research around the world, and journals are expecting like 50, 60 subjects for eye movement study, and rustling up 50 or 60, good folks who don't. Whose eyes are still good, and between whatever it is, 18 and 40, really difficult. And so I think that partly here's another one of those places where we need to educate the journals. First of all, it's going to be hard to just add an extra little study, which you'll often get requested for. Back to the field, and secondly, they could complain about the number of subjects. And I think it's there just worth reminding folks that, there are fields like psychophysics where, the whole color J and Ds are done on 3 French, I think, subjects. And we still use all that data, and we think that's fine. Similarly, with phonetics, it's quite standard to use it's a good sample is 5 males and 5 females. So somehow here we are. There's obviously issues of power and so on that need to be thought out. But anyway, my plug is that the normal standards sometimes are really rather difficult to achieve. Okay, and then they've got the causes that if you're trying to use a control subject pool back home, how do you find one that's at all good? We've used, for example, aphasia control groups, which are at least drawn from the general population, different ages and so on. So there, but anyway, that's a serious sort of issue. Then there are gender issues, experiments that might need to be the same gender as the people being tested, and I'll just give you a kind of another anecdote just about my eye movement studies on Russell Island. So I said to I was using a particular fellow to round up participants for me, and I said, look, I really want them, I want somewhere between 20 and 40 roughly, Anyway, I was getting these aged creatures coming, and one after another, and I kept saying, well, actually, I couldn't cut it. The machinery wouldn't work. I couldn't do that. Uncorrected vision. I couldn't see anything. Okay, so next one came in. Oh, also ancient. Couldn't see anything, and kind of eventually rumbled the fact that I was giving one, bag of rice for each subject, and the person I was using to rustle up participants was thinking, well, who's most needy? Widows and the widows. And so in this sort of way, you're going to run into these problems about getting. Anyway, principle 6 is also, yeah. Oh, shit. Okay, well, I can do these fast, I think. Don't pollute the subject pool. This is actually pretty difficult, as we know. So Dan, had to get experimental privacy by great giant curtains and things. And once you're into sort of small, dense networks, how do you stop them talking to each other? And I don't think there are brilliant solutions here, but obviously if you can make the experiment so opaque that what doesn't matter, that would be good. And there are various other solutions people have thought about, having very carefully, don't self-pollute your pool by running one experiment that's somehow related to another. You keep very careful notes on, who's done what and so on. And then there's the hit and run technique, which has been used. So you sort of drop in on a village, and before they know what, they have a chance to kind of confabulate, you're off. And that's been used in a recent PNAS paper. But the problem there is it runs into my don't be a tourist principle. Anyway, yeah, and maybe if I had a bit more time, I'd give you another anecdote in detail about how I went amiss, but never mind. It's just that I had myself, climbing mountains to get samples of tree bark, because it turned out that people were very sensitive to different tree bark. and then I run half the subject, and then overnight the samples rotted, and then I sent out somebody to collect the rest, and then the word was out. About exactly which samples, which kind of changed the experiment. It didn't ruin it for people. So principle 7, consortia. So here, I think I just want to make a plug that you need to kind of bring these folks together repeatedly, because if you're doing a big project, you really need to agree about how exactly you're going to run things, and on what you're going to do exactly. And I think another bit of advice is, please don't shortchange the facilitators. These are the linguists or other folks or ethnographers who are actually doing the experiment, but they may have your results, the way you frame the results, may not play very well or be of interest to their discipline. So you have to think out how you're going to reward them satisfactorily. And maybe one solution is to have a book, for example, in which they can do a much deeper interpretation of the results that they hope to get, so on. But anyway, I think you've just got to work this out. Okay, I'm getting there. I've just got 2 more to go, and they're short. So the other thing that nowadays I think it's very clear is that the community should gain from your project, and then obviously involves a proper negotiation with the community. I think this is now standard in linguistics, but maybe not in cross-cultural psychology. I don't know. And it's not going to be sufficient just to reward the participants. You've got to think about because they let you in. They have it's an undertaking, a joint undertaking, and there has to be something in it for them. It can be very variable, I think, but you do have to think how can we reward folks for their participation. Okay. Finally, I just want to remark that their ethics aren't going to be your ethics, as it were, and so the IRB requirements are often, frankly, irrelevant and insane. And it's completely unethical, obviously, to get people to sign documents they don't understand. That's how native peoples around the world sign away their land and so on. I mean, so you can't do this. So you have to sort of figure out how to get it in a way which is genuine, that you've got informed consent, not just meeting your IRB requirements. Yeah, and so all of the issues about what is improper and so on really should be locally, has to be sort of thought out. Okay, those were my 9 principles, I have to just confess that I have not always myself lived up to my principle, but I'm a wiser man now. So yeah, I'd like to.